that the masses are behind him, and also that the continued reform process would weaken his position and his party's position, as always the EU reforms did in all these negotiating or candidate countries. So that was where it began, and I think we can now, looking back in hindsight, see that one critical moment was at the end of 2011, when the AKP, perhaps at the strongest, at the zenith of its power, decided to centralize intelligence mechanisms which were scattered. There was military intelligence, gendarmerie intelligence, civilian intelligence, and police intelligence. All these four, this rectangular, were separate and going its own ways. And this was a very critical moment at the very end of the 2011, and it led to turmoil, which was not freely public at that time. And remarkably and coincidentally perhaps, or perhaps uncoincidentally, 3 or 4 days after the Roboski, so-called Roboski massacre takes place, where 34 Kurdish villagers are basically killed by the Turkish jets just across the Turkish-Iraqi border. Whether these two incidents were related or not, we leave it to the historians. But I think it is something that should be drawn attention to. And also, I think the second element of helping the reversal, preparing the ground, was the increasingly self-abiding attitudes of the rotten core of the so-called mainstream media, beginning from 2012, obeying every instruction, order, or demand personally from the then Prime Minister to fire people, critical voices, from beginning with the priority of TV, because that's the most powerful medium in Turkey, like in Russia, and also from the newspapers. All those critical columnists particularly, and then also reporters, started to be fired, and then they lost their jobs to be replaced by more sycophant-minded or spirited colleagues in the media. And the more this continued, this pattern, I think Erdogan saw the gates opening to new choices for authoritarianism. And also Gezi Park protests, as mentioned by David here, it's a critical, of course, rupture point, very spectacular. It's as a social and cultural resistance, perhaps the final one, really involving the diverse segments of the mainly youth, urban youth of the Turkish society, helped also, or led, the founding fathers of the AKP, other than Mr. Erdogan, to back off in a way, and not really standing up to the Prime Minister's authoritarian measures. And this was also another move that he saw, sort of a possibility to take full control, personal control of the party, which was until then more of a collective and of a microcosm of Turkish society's conservative, right, pious segments. And also, it continued with the graft probes, the famous two famous graft probes at the end of the same year, 2013, which this time, in addition to the media, makes visible insufficient resilience of the judiciary bodies, and also of the police. I think there we see the bending, slow motion bending of the judiciary to the political executive. And then also passivity, remarkable passivity of the main opposition, in order not to challenge in a more dramatic way the corruption charged power, beginning from 2014, mainly looking the other way, because it was seen as two partners parting ways. Nothing more than that. And the main issue, which is the corruption, gets lost in transition or translation. So this was also when the Kurdish peace process involving the Kurdish political movement and its supporters to also, in a remarkable way, not getting engaged enough to battle and challenge the corruption-charged top leadership of the AKP. So on top of that, you see a very cunning Machiavellian politician who sees these divisions and polarities in the oppositional segments in order to convert them to his favor. So this oppression of the Gülenist segment, which everyone blamed for the Kurdish oppression earlier, or the Graft probe eruption, is looked in a very passive way, all these, because of these elements, and it kept more and more. It loaded a lot of power to AKP, to also starting to manage the opposition polls to its favor. Meanwhile, another element comes into the play: the old guard, which was charged with trials, the extrajudiciary killings of the Kurds, the so-called faili meçhul cinayetler, or the famous spectacular Ergenekon or Balyoz sledgehammer trials, whose core was substantial enough, but later on completely messed up by the mainly Gülenist prosecutors in their own utilitarian ways. They lead also to the old guard starting to reassemble as these authoritarianist tendencies become more visible. So then the rupture comes that would bring Erdogan to a watershed, which is the June 7 elections in 2015, with this background, against this background, and it leads to enormous, huge, spectacular support for the peace process, with the pro-Kurdish HDP party getting more than 13% and entering into parliament with 80 deputies, a historic peak, which is of course speaking for support for the peace process, but which shatters the ground in Ankara, in the dark circles, in the old guard, etc. And of course this is a defeat for Erdogan after so many years, and he remains silent, and after a while realizing that the entry of 80 deputies, Kurdish deputies in parliament, may begin to lead his fall politically. And this one is very important to notice, because to underline, because there are some signs that the overturning of the peace negotiations table, which follows this defeat for Erdogan, has to do with appeasing certain segments of the state in Ankara and sort of realigning himself with those forces instead of going the way of peace. This is a historic watershed, the summer of 2015. From then on, we see the rapprochement between the ruling AKP and ultra-right or ultra-nationalist fourth party, MHP, coming closer and closer. And this is the beginning of a new formation, and this is when it dawns upon most of the observers that a new old-style reversal type of alliance is in the making in Ankara, in disfavor of the solution of the Kurdish problem. And it leads to scorched earth policies, And then, of course, this scorched earth policies emboldens the hardliners in bureaucracy and also in politics even further, and makes Erdogan, in a sense, much stronger, because of the fear of terror is spreading across or beyond the table, but across the board of the secular segments, even the voters, not only the conservatives or nationalists. And he emerges as powerfully victorious in the November elections in 2015. But then something happens, something is in the making, because the scorched earth policies is a full reversal, a U-turn that causes a stir on the upper echelons of the army, the top leadership of the top, the top brass. You may label them whatever, but mainly pro-NATO and mainly Gülenist segments, and some maybe civilian-minded, reform-minded, high-level, high-rank officers, and the others are beginning to get away from each other, and there's some sort of a gap on the top echelons as of early 2016. And I think the last rupture point is the ousting of Ahmet Davutoğlu as prime minister. And I think this was the last one, because Davutoğlu and his team of advisors did their last-ditch effort to keep Turkey closer to the EU, as much as to end the peace process if they could at that moment. And we don't know what happened in May, 2 months before the attempted coup, but he is out of the political picture, which tells us all that Erdogan is in full control as president of Turkey. So, to sum up, I think I'm coming to the end of my presentation, but I will have some figures for you to consider. What was the true nature of the coup? We still have no answer. We had long, very acrimonious work of the Parliamentary Commission of the coup, which ended in disarray, where the main opposition CHP and pro-Kurdish HDP had to put their own dissent to the report, which they accused of the AKP of manipulating the public, which they accused also of saying that the AKP hid certain shady parts of the coup attempt from the public knowledge, not only domestic but also international. So the failure of that commission, the collapse of that work, is significant enough to claim that we don't have enough. We only have suspicions, continuing suspicions about the true nature of the coup. And more than that, I think at this stage, we cannot say, despite such a long time having passed. And I think, in a way, the coup seems to be a main rupture point, but you could also interpret it as a changing gear to a higher gear in a slow motion, what I call a slow motion coup, civilian coup, starting from 2011, nearing its completion as of now. We are now past the 16th of April referendum, which paves the way for super presidency in Turkey, or ultra presidency, whatever you may want to call it. And it also makes it quite impossible for the opposition to come to power through democratic means. The very nature of the referendum means just that. So where are we now in terms of, Nate Schenken of Freedom House has written, and according to him, of course, the modern Turkey's institutions have been weak always in terms of democratic accountability and the protection of human rights. And what came after the attempted coup as state of emergency, a decree regime, which has been going on for 1.5 years now, endlessly, ad infinitum extension of the state of emergency, has made things far, far worse. It has been weak, the basis of the rule of law, as Schenken argues, and legal and constitutional tradition, of course, puts a greater priority, has always done, for the unity of the Turkish nation and the integrity of state than on the rights of the individuals and his rights or her rights. So, having abandoned the European Union process, the reform process, the Turkey under emergency rule presents to the world a picture of self-destruction in a way. And this self-destruction, according to the data that we have assembled, leading some 150,000 people have passed through police custody, an equal number have lost their jobs irreversibly, most probably, and one out of these 150,000, 60,000 approximately have been arrested, and the number is about 50,000 now. 160 approximately journalists are in prison, and many institutions have been shattered, hit by this wave of measures through the decree regime. Nearly 1,500 associations have been closed. 162 media outlets have been shut down, news agencies and TV channels, etc. And unions, 19 or 20 of them have been closed. Nearly 1,000 companies valued at approximately $15 billion have been seized. Some say, critics, looted under those emergencies rule circumstances. And even 2 members of the Constitutional Court were removed from their positions. And judges and prosecutors, nearly 5,000 of them, 1/3 of the entire core, judicial core, has been arrested, etc., etc. So, all these figures, what do they tell us? I think, in a summary, what they tell us is that Turkey, which began its European Union journey, is no longer having a free media, no longer having separation of powers, no longer having a rule of law as we know it. And in a summary, it is not even close to where it began, the European Union membership negotiations at the end of 2004. It has fallen back from the Copenhagen criteria. It doesn't anymore qualify for continuation of the negotiations, membership negotiations. This is the drama. This is the intensity, the grade of the drama that we are facing. And of course, it spills over to its relations with the European Union members. Recently with Netherlands, with Germany. German coalition partners now have declared no continuity with the membership negotiations. Netherlands withdraws its ambassador, and also France becoming more and more critical of the incursion. This all tells us of also the relationship with the United States collapsing rapidly, increasingly rapidly. So this is where we are at in terms of recap. I think this may be time for stopping here, having presented you this picture, and maybe continue with the questions.
Thanks very much indeed, Roberto. It was a masterly and pressing survey. I'm going to abuse my position as chairman.